Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. Welcome to the ASEAN ROK Logistics Think and Biz Forum. Biz Forum and policy sessions are held in parallel. And right here, we are ready for the policy session, and I am the MC, Kim Min-hui. As you are well aware, the ASEAN ROK Logistics Think and Biz Forum is being held for the first time this year. Therefore, we have participants online and offline, and we look forward to your insights so that we can take the very solid first step forward for this very event. I ask you for your active participation, and we will now start the policy session. But let me give you a few housekeeping announcements first. We have 3 sessions ready today. This morning, we will address the topic of macroeconomy to look at cooperation in the post-COVID world. And we'll be inviting the moderator, presenters, and panelists. After introducing the presenters and all 3 presentations are complete, we will invite the moderator and all the presenters as well as the panelists for a panel session, which will be held online and offline. Korean and English simultaneous interpretation is being provided today. Korean is session 1, English is channel 2. Korean channel 1, English channel 2. And for smooth proceedings of today's event, I'd ask the presenters to keep your presentations within 15 to 17 minutes. Let me introduce the very first speaker today. Director Min Hyuk-ki of Trade Policy Division of KIET, Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade, to present the topic New South Korea ASEAN Cooperation Plans After COVID-19. Please welcome Mr. Min with a big round of applause. Hello. I am Min Hyuk-ki from KIET. I didn't expect to be the first speaker, but here I am. I hope you have a rewarding time, and I hope we can find ways to further advance the cooperation between South Korea and ASEAN. And today I will be speaking about new ROK ASEAN cooperation plans after COVID-19. So 15 minutes is not enough to cover expansive topic. So I will just like to give you an overview here during the presentation, and later during the panel session, I would like to make some further comments to complement my presentation. So,
예, 물론 이제 대답은 못 하시겠지만 안 하시겠지만 우리나라의 문재인 정부 출범 이후에 아세안과의 협력을 기존의 주변 4대 강국과 마찬가지로 좀 격상시키는 그러한 그렇게 위치 지으면서 좀 강화해 나가려고 했는데 이런 것들이 과연 잘 되고 있는 것인가 이 부분에 대해서 한번 생각해 볼 필요가 있는 것 같습니다. 기본적으로 이제 저희가 협력 관계를 얘기할 때 뭐 경제적인 통계치라든가 이런 것들을 가지고 많은 얘기를 하는 경우가 많은데 그런 부분들은 어떻게 보면 조금씩 개선되고 있다라는 것들을 우리가 볼 수가 있습니다. 투자라든가 수출입이라든가 이런 것들이 좀 개선되고 있는데 이런 것들이 그럼 과연 지속 가능하고 향후에도 더욱더 발전되는 관계로 나아갈 수
has the possibility to get even better in the future. I think those are questions we need to
기존에도 저희가 우리나라가 어떤 나라와 협력을 할 때 언제나 이게 경제 협력이나 이런 것들은 그냥 이렇게 부침이 심해서 어떤 때는 잘 되다가 어떤 때는 또 안 되다가 이러한 그런 모습들을 종종 보여왔기 때문에 이러한 관계가 아니라 지속 가능한 그러한 협력 관계를 구축하기 위해서 어떻게 나아가야 될 것인가를 한번 생각해 보는 것들이 필요할 것 같습니다.
be pondered on.
예. 그래서 제가 오늘 말씀드릴 내용은
So
다섯
this is the
가지인데요.
topic of
사실
my
뭐
presentation. I
간략하기
have
때문에 그렇게
5
오랜 시간이 걸릴
topics,
것 같지는
but
않습니다.
each
그래서
very short.
첫 번째로는
It should not take too long.
코로나19의
The first
현황하고
topic
그
is the
추이를 좀
current status
살펴보고요.
and trends of
두 번째는
COVID-19.
코로나의 경제적
And then I'd
파급
move
효과를
on to the economic
경제
impact or
성장률과
ripple effects of
외국인
COVID-19 in
투자
terms of
측면에서
the
좀
growth rate
살펴보도록
and
하겠습니다. 그리고 세
FDI.
번째로는 코로나
Thirdly,
시기에
I will also look at
코로나
the
벌써 이제
changes
2년이
taking
됐는데
place in
어떻게
the
경제
era of
주체들이
COVID-19, which has
자신들의
broken out 2
비헤이비어를
years ago already. How the economic actors
변화시켜 나가고
are
있고
changing
어떤
their
것들이 좀
behaviors, what
필요로
kind of
되어지고 있는가 이런
new
부분들을 좀
needs are
살펴보도록 하고요.
arising.
네 번째로는
The
한국과
fourth
아세안
topic
간의 협력
is
방안
current
현황에
status
대해서
of South Korea and ASEAN
좀 살펴보고
cooperation.
마지막으로 그래서
And
코로나
finally, I'd like
이후에
to
우리는
conclude
어떤
with
식의 협력 방안을
what kind of
가져가야 될
cooperation
것인가를
plans we need to
살펴보도록
have in
하겠습니다.
place for the post-COVID
첫
world
번째로
between South Korea and ASEAN.
코로나의
So let me
그
start with
현황에
the
대해서
first topic.
살펴보면
This is the current
11월
status of
후에
COVID-19.
수인데요. 보시는
These
바와
are
같이
numbers
뭐
from
굉장히
early
많은
November.
수의
As you can see,
사람들이
you
코로나에
have-
확진이 되고 많은
we
사람들이
have a large
사람들이
number of confirmed
코로나로
cases
인하여
and
사망하기도 하고
unfortunate
그런
deaths.
현상들이 발생을 했고요.
One too many.
물론 이제 인도네시아 같은 인구 대국 같은 경우는 굉장히
But
많은
for
수의
Indonesia,
확진자와
which has a huge
사망자가 발생하고
population,
있는 것을
both
확인할
the
수
deaths
있습니다.
and new confirmed
두
cases
번째는
are
이
large.
추이를 보여주고 있는
Secondly,
건데요.
this is the
국가들이
overall
어떻게
trend of
신규 확진자들이
COVID-19,
어떻게
how key
변화하고
nations,
있는가를
how the new
볼
cases
수가
of
있는데
COVID-19
이거는
has
이제 첫
been
번째로는 초기 대응을
emerging
어떻게
in
했냐에
major countries.
따라서
But
신규
first of all,
확진자가 언제 발생했고
COVID-19
어떤
broke
식으로
out at different
진행되는가를
times
보여주고
depending on the
있습니다.
initial response by each
그래서
country. So
베트남이나 태국
when the
같은
first
경우는
confirmed
초기에
patient
이렇게 대응을 굉장히 좀 봉쇄적인
appeared
대응을
and
했기
what
때문에
happened
이런 신규
since
확진자가 좀
then.
늦게
So
발생한 반면에
countries that
한국 같은
engaged
경우에
in
초기에
strong
좀 발생을 했고
containment
그리고
from early
뭐
on
여러 국가들도 비슷한 추이를 보이고 있습니다. 근데 여기서
found
우리가
that the
확인할 수 있는 거
COVID-19 broke
하나는
out at a later stage.
언제
But
발생했든 어느
whenever
정도의 규모로
COVID-19 broke out,
발생했든
at what
그것들도 중요하지만
scale,
그와 함께
those
우리가 확인할
factors
수
are
있는 건
important, but we need
이게
to
완전히
confirm here that
코로나를 극복하는 시기로는 가기가 굉장히
it's very
어렵다는
difficult for
점입니다.
us
그래서
to completely eradicate
코로나 대응을
COVID-19.
잘해서 신규 확진자가
can
감소하는
respond well,
시기도 있지만
And
또다시 신규
sometimes
확진자가
the cases
증가하기도
go
하고
down, but
그래서
then
이러한
they reappear.
그래프를 통해서 우리가 확인할 수 있는 거는
So from these
코로나는
graphs,
이렇게
we can
단기적인
see
현상이 절대 될
that
수 없다.
COVID-19 cannot be
지속적인
a
현상이고
one-off
계속적으로
phenomenon. It is
증가와
a
감소를
persisting
반복할 것이다.
trend that
특히나
will continue its fluctuations.
세계
And
경제가 굉장히
in
지금
particular,
글로벌화되어
when
있고
the economy
서로 간의
has
교류가
globalized and
굉장히
exchanges
많은 상태에서는
are very actively
봉쇄를
taking
통해서
place, a
코로나를
complete shutdown
극복하는 거는
to overcome COVID-19
불가능할 뿐만
is
아니라
not only
적절한 대응도
impossible,
아니라는 것을 알 수 있습니다.
but not the best
그래서
of
결국은 필요한 게 뭐냐면
response to be taken. So
글로벌
in the end, what we need
차원에서도
is,
마찬가지고 지역 차원에서도
both at the global
마찬가지고
level and at the
서로 상호
regional
공조를
level,
통해서
we
이러한
need
것들을
to coordinate
나가야 될 거라는
and take a joint response to overcome
그다음에 세 번째로
COVID-19.
다음
And the
부분은
next
이제
topic
코로나가
is
어떻게 경제적 효과를
the
미쳤는가
economic impact of COVID-19. What are the ripple effects?
기본적으로 아세안의 경제
So
성장률은
basically, the growth rate of ASEAN region has always been higher than the global average. But during the spread of COVID-19, ASEAN also was dealt a blow.
2000년
You can see here that in 2020, the growth rate was -4% for ASEAN. And this year, ASEAN has entered into a recovery stage, but has yet to reach the pre-COVID level.
FDI 같은 경우에도
Meanwhile, in terms of FDI in general,
전반적으로 유입된
FDI into ASEAN has been steadily rising, but that declined in 2020.
하나는 뭐냐면 이 FDI
But what's important here is that
같은 경우에
FDI, just like economic growth rate,
일어났었고
for FDI, there has been an overall decline. And if you look at the share of ASEAN out of global FDI, although the absolute volume of FDI has been declining, the overall share of ASEAN in global FDI is rising. That means ASEAN's importance is being recognized, and more countries are willing to invest in ASEAN nations.
반면에 이제
Meanwhile,
관련해서 이러한
regarding FDI,
적으로 일어나고 있습니다. 그러니까 모든 부분에서 동일하게 감소를
we do see asymmetrical flow. There is a decline in FDI, but it differs for different sectors. So most notably, if you look at manufacturing, the decline in FDI was very markedly there. So we had about $440 billion in FDI in 2019, but that dropped to about 200 million. But if you look at services, you see a relatively moderate level of FDI flowing into services. The next topic is what kind of changes are taking place among the economic actors since the breakout of COVID-19 in terms of their behavior. So as I said earlier, in terms of healthcare and medical sectors, experts say that even if we overcome COVID-19, a global pandemic can always arise again. And even COVID-19, we never know when we will be able to overcome COVID-19, although many countries are opting to live along with COVID-19, but the situation remains uncertain. And if you look at countries in Europe, they started to try out living alongside COVID-19, but with the sudden surge in confirmed cases, they went back to a shutdown. So COVID-19 has to be looked at as a mid to long-term phenomenon. And if this is what's going to happen in the mid to long run, the behavior of economic actors are bound to change. So let's look at this one by one. For consumers, the big change is that the place of consumption is changing. Consumers used to consume outside their homes, but now the stay-at-home economy has grown. And also consumption is more focused on values rather than brands, because in a way, brand is important in terms of human relations with others, what kind of food you eat and cars you drive. But as you spend more and more time at home, you focus more onto yourselves. The consumers are focusing more onto themselves, and they consume and place value place a priority on value. And of course, non-face-to-face consumption is spreading not only in Korea, but for ASEAN nations, I presume. And with that, consumption, value-centered consumption is rising very strongly because people are spending more time and more time alone at home. And that is what is boosting stay-at-home economy. And in terms of business, because of non-face-to-face services and because of COVID-19, we are focused on reducing physical contact, face-to-face contact, and in the process, naturally, reliance on labor is being reduced and is being pushed down. So notably, there is emphasis on automation, and new forms of work, such as remote working, are being adopted by businesses. And as you are well aware, automation is not a phenomenon that suddenly emerged because of COVID-19. With the fourth industrial revolution, automation already began, but COVID-19 has accelerated this trend. And in step with that change, businesses are quickly changing and adjusting their behavior. Another case in point is that they are adjusting their corporate strategy. Because, for example, as uncertainty is expanding, what is most important here is to secure cash and cash liquidity. And in terms of business, they are changing their business portfolio. For example, in the past, when businesses made all of their investment in manufacturing, they are moving away to combine services with manufacturing, and they are looking into services to include services as part of their business portfolio. And in terms of industry, as I mentioned before, some sectors see a modest level of FDI, some have seen a major rollback. Likewise, the impact of COVID-19 onto different sectors have been different. As a result, growth rate in different sectors due to the COVID-19 impact is taking place in different degrees. And with digital sectors or non-face-to-face sectors, we are seeing greater emphasis. And likewise, environment is being considered to be a very important and significant area. At the national level, with the spread of COVID-19, the role of the government is considered to be very important, and the spread of the government role is taking place. Deglobalization is also taking place, not only because of COVID-19, but also triggered by the US-China trade tensions. And what's important here is to build a stable supply chain in core industries and strategies, and to embed a solid supply chain. So these are the pain points for the government and the state. The fourth point, the current status of Korea-ASEAN cooperation. The economic growth rate of ASEAN was shown earlier. Between Korea and ASEAN, the trade volume was on a steady rise, but since 2000s, slightly decreased or remained stagnant. Well, in fact, since 2020, the rate of decline was higher for Korea-ASEAN trade than for the rest of the world and Korea trade. This is partly affected by the fact that leading economies are recovering more quickly in relative terms than the rest of the world, and also China is moderately recovering well as well. So the trade between Korea and ASEAN regions, because of these factors, seems to have declined more pronouncedly. And in terms of FDI, this can be explained in a slightly different perspective. Korea's FDI into ASEAN declined by 4.1% in 2020, but that degree of decline is really much smaller than Korea's FDI into the rest of the world, which was a negative 11.2%. And I think that this shows that although trade is very sensitive to changes in the environment immediately, investment does not happen with a short period of perspective. It happens with a longer term perspective in mind. And so Korean companies are recognizing the importance of ASEAN, and this perception continues on. And that is why I think Korea's decline in investment in ASEAN was much smaller than compared to the other parts of the world. And so I'm coming to my final point. Then how can Korea and ASEAN pursue cooperation going forward? Of course, after COVID-19, ASEAN nations have come up with various policy measures, and governments have been playing different roles accordingly. And also, ASEAN has come up with what they call the ACRF, the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, and you can see the areas where ASEAN will be focusing on for economic recovery. The first strategy is enhancing health systems. Secondly, strengthening human security, maximizing the potential of intra-ASEAN market, accelerating inclusive digital transformation, and finally, advancing towards a more sustainable and resilient future. This is focused on eco-friendliness, and please refer to my slide for the details. And likewise in Korea, since this government took office, the new Southern policy was rolled out. And based on the achievements and tasks of New Southern Policy, a New Southern Policy Plus has been established with 7 initiatives and central projects that go hand in hand. So the 7 initiatives are very similar in content with ACRF strategies. So on my last point, how are we going to pursue cooperation in the future? First, we need to think of the areas of cooperation. Of course, the existing areas of cooperation must continue on, and we need to expand it. And secondly, in healthcare, digital, and environmental sectors, we need to reinforce our cooperation. And thirdly, we need to support the integration and connectivity of ASEAN region. And we also need to bolster the qualitative side of human exchanges, not only training and education, but we can pursue joint research for win-win and mutually beneficial cooperation. And we need to go beyond economics to include cultural, political, and diplomatic cooperation. And as for means, the method of cooperation, we need to continue to pursue mutually complementary cooperation, and we need to make use of non-face-to-face method of cooperation, and also for sustainability, rather than pursuing trade surplus or exports, we need to take a more mutually beneficial approach. Digital areas are where we can take preemptive approach to build a global standards through cooperation. And last but not least, we need to secure a regional supply chain together with a relevant strategy in place. I'm sorry I went overboard and used up too much. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. That was Director Bin Hyuk-ki from KIET on the New Korea ASEAN post-COVID cooperation measures. In a short time of 15 minutes, you delivered a very informative presentation, and please continue on with an in-depth discussion in the panel session. So I'd like to ask all participants to join us until the panel session. So let me introduce the second presenter. We have Associate Research Fellow Ra Mi-ryung from KIEP.
방안을 주제로 발표해 주시겠습니다. 온라인으로 박사님을 모셨습니다. 인사 나눠보겠습니다. 박사님 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요.
네, 발표를 위해서 화면 공유를
Good morning.
부탁드리겠습니다.
Could you please start sharing your screen, your presentation? Yes, I'm sharing my presentation slides. Are you ready to proceed with your presentation? Yes, I'll begin my presentation. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am from Kiev. I am Ra Mi-ryung. So before I begin my presentation, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organizer for inviting me. And due to my personal reasons, I was unable to join you for the offline event. The presentation is titled The Direction of ASEAN ROK Cooperation in the Post-COVID-19 Era. I will give my presentation in the following orders. First, I will talk about the existing cooperative relations between ASEAN and ROK in the pre-COVID-19 era. Then I will talk about the COVID-19, its impact and response to the ASEAN-ROK relations, and I will talk about Korea's policies as well as response measures taken by ASEAN for COVID-19. And the last part of the presentation will focus on the directions of ASEAN-ROK cooperation after COVID-19. First, cooperative relations between ASEAN and ROK pre-COVID-19. So in 1989, the partnership between the Republic of Korea and ASEAN began with the establishment of the dialogue partnership. They've been working very closely together. And also in 2005, there was a signing of framework agreement for ASEAN-ROK. And in 2006, ASEAN-ROK FTA on trade in goods was signed, and ASEAN-ROK FTA in services was signed in 2007. And in 2017, there was an introduction of new Southern policy in order to enhance the relations with the ASEAN countries to the level of 4 major powers. And in 2020, there was an announcement of the new Southern Policy Plus. And including the 10 countries of the ASEAN, the Mega FTA RCEP agreement was signed in 2020. So between Korea and ASEAN, cooperative relations has been maintained thus far. So we've been celebrating about 30 years of partnership in terms of trade and investment. So there has been about 20-fold growth in terms of trade and 40-fold growth in terms of mutual visits between the two regions, or people-to-people exchanges. So let's take a look at some graphs. So after the dialogue relations was established in 1989, bilateral trade has been growing continuously. In 2009, right after the global financial crisis, and some of the periods, except for these periods, we've seen rapid increase in terms of bilateral trade between the two regions. And not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of investment. We've seen a significant investment from Korea to ASEAN, as well as the number of companies established in the ASEAN region. We've seen a considerable number of growth in terms of the companies. Also, in terms of the mutual growth, in terms of the exchanges, ASEAN has been the #1 country with the most number of Korean visitors to the region. 12.7 million people have visited the ASEAN region in 2000. Although it's not included here in the slide, for the first time as a dialogue country, ASEAN Cultural Center was established back in 2019. So there has been a lot of physical as well as people-to-people exchanges prior to the COVID-19. We've been very important economic partners to each other in the pre-COVID-19 era. So let's now move to the second part of the presentation, which is the COVID-19 era, its impact and response to the economy of Korea as well as that of the ASEAN countries, and what are some of the measures that were introduced by each country in the ASEAN region. First of all, COVID-19, especially over the short-term period, has had an impact on economy. It has actually triggered economic recession. Except for some of the countries in ASEAN, most of the economies have actually posted a negative growth. And in 2020, if you look at the real GDP growth rate, it was actually minus 4.2% across the board, which was the first time that the economies actually recorded a minus growth rate in 20 years. Not only in terms of the real GDP growth rate, but also in terms of the unemployment rate. After the COVID-19 struck, we can see that there has been a significant increase in the unemployment rate as well. So the pandemic has triggered the short-term recession and also increased uncertainties across the board. First of all, it's quite uncertain when the COVID-19 is going to come to an end. And we see a return to protectionism. And of course, we saw this trend in the pre-COVID-19 era, but we see the realignment or the accelerated restructuring of global supply chain and also deepening conflicts between the United States and China. So these are external uncertainties that are rising on the board. And also, we see a transition to digital as well as low-carbon economy. There are some structural transformations that we see at the same time. But fortunate to say that in 2021, or with the start of the year, economies seem to now be making some recoveries. So in this new year, 2021, economic growth rate, according to the Kiev Global Economic Outlook, is expected at 5.9%. And for the ASEAN major economies in the first half of the year, due to the base effect, the economic growth has been quite positive, according to our view. But in the second half of the year, there are some risk factors to be considered, such as the Delta variant and how the countries are going to be able to control the spread of the Delta virus. That is going to make or break the economic growth rate for the second half of the year. So economic impact from COVID-19 as well as external environment and changes have been explained to you. And I will now talk about the policy measures, responses taken by the South Korean government as well as ASEAN economies. As I mentioned before, due to the pandemic, there has been a significant recession as well as structural transformation taking place at the same time. And in order to address these challenges, Korea has come up with a plan called the Korean New Deal. The Korean New Deal, by definition, is about addressing the COVID-19 crisis, making a recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and also to respond to the accelerated transition to structural transformation and to become a leading economy in the 21st century. So basically, it is composed of Digital New Deal and Green New Deal. So the slide shows that there are fiscal investment and institutional improvements that are backing up the framework, that the government is putting in a lot of fiscal investment in order to induce investment from the private sector and also to lead in innovation. By 2025, 160 trillion won is going to be put in to generate about 1.9 million jobs. We have come up with 28 projects and total 10 key projects. So we're going to be placing an emphasis on these various types of projects over here. So this is the K New Deal that was published in 2020, but it went through some revisions afterwards. And the Korean New Deal 2.0 version was announced. So the overall framework remains the same, and the overarching goal also remains intact. So just please be mindful of the fact that I'm using the 2020 version for this particular presentation. But anyway, there are 28 projects that the Korean government is going to be focusing on. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And due to the pandemic, we're seeing disproportionate impact placed on the vulnerable groups, and also to address blind spots in society. The government also wants to strengthen the social safety nets. So there are three strong pillars that are propping up the Korean New Deal. So what are the response measures undertaken by the ASEAN, ACRF, which is ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework? This was also mentioned by the previous speaker. In 2020, there was an ASEAN summit which adopted the ACRF. This was a whole of community exit strategy for ASEAN from COVID-19 crisis. What we can see from the document here is that the integrated agenda for ASEAN remains the same, but digital transformation as well as inclusiveness and sustainability, these three pillars are going to gain greater importance going forward. And the integration agenda is reorganized and consolidated into 5 different areas, centering around these 3 important imperatives. Mr. Min already talked about these areas before, so I'm just going to be skipping this part. So we have a Korea's response strategy as well as ASEAN's response strategy. So due to the COVID-19 pandemic, NSP was upgraded to NSP Plus last year. That is another pillar that was announced by the Korean government. So because there is an increasing demand for cooperation in healthcare and also realignment of GBC and also an accelerated transition to digital economy, and also the pandemic is also increasing demand for new type of cooperation. Hence, the government unveiled the NSP Plus policy. So again, there are 7 major initiatives that are in the NSP Plus. I am sorry to say that I don't have a slide on that. If you compare between the ACRF and NSP Plus, we can see that there's a lot of overlap between the 2 frameworks, especially except for the cultural exchanges. 5 strategies of the ACRF exactly match one-on-one to that of the NSP Plus. So the first exchange is related to the foundation for cooperation. We can say that the two strategies of Korea and ASEAN are very similar and have a lot in common. So the cooperation or the direction for cooperation between the two regions will have to take place based on the foundation of NSP Plus and ACRF, which would be actually my conclusion from the presentation. So they have to go hand in hand, and the measures or the direction for cooperation would have to become more concrete going forward. So I'm moving into my final part of the presentation. So the direction of ASEAN ROK cooperation after COVID-19. So policies of the two regions. So how are we going to be shaping our new strategy going forward, especially in terms of promoting our cooperation? So I briefly talked about the Korean New Deal, which is really focused on the domestic Korean market. But even within the Korean New Deal framework, there are many areas of cooperation that can be pursued with ASEAN economies. If K-New Deal is linked to new certain policy, in terms of policy, it could really mean a lot. So I want to point out the fact that there's a need to have this political alignment between policy alignment between the new Southern policy and K-New Deal. There are, for example, knowledge sharing programs, KSP, which is policy advisory projects that can be related to the infrastructure projects as a package deals under the Korean New Deal, and the Digital New Deal and Green New Deal can also be linked to the existing ASEAN cooperation projects or programs. As for concrete measures for cooperation, well, I understand that there are time limits to the presentation, so let me just take one example here. For K-New Deal, we have a data and new dam construction initiative, which is using public data and giving access to the private sector with the government's initiative to lead digital transition. So there are 140,000 public data that is open for access by the private sector for innovation. So ASEAN can, for example, provide support for the establishment of such database platforms. And new renewable energy can be utilized for providing support for grid network. So this could be a potential area of cooperation between Korea and ASEAN. And another area that we could consider is RCEP. We had a signing for RCEP last year. And right now, Singapore, Thailand, Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, China, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand have finished their domestic ratification procedure. So by January next year, 2022, it will be able to go into effect. So we can think about utilizing RCEP for further cooperation. So I'll just have to move to the next slide. So we can think about linking the ACRF to NSP Plus, because there's a lot of overlaps. There are a lot of overlaps between two policies. If you look at the implementation plan under the ACRF and the detailed plan of action under the NSP Plus, we can see that there are a lot of commonalities between the two frameworks. These two policies, if they're linked together, we can come up with ways for promoting practical cooperation. I am sorry if I have rambled on with my presentation, but I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you very much. I'll see you again during the discussion session. Thank you very much. So that was Dr. La Mi-ryung from Kiev. She talked about the impact from COVID-19 and how Korea has been responding to this, as well as what ASEAN economies have been doing, and what type of an alignment that we can seek in terms of policies between the two regions for further cooperation. So thank you very much for the presentation. Next presentation will be delivered by our speaker from Vietnam, Dr. Nguyen Huong Hoang. We would like to say hello to you, Dr. Huang.
Thank you for your participation at this very early time. I heard that it's too early in your time zone. Too early?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to have a chance to present my paper on this very important forum, because I got very short notice of invitation to be a speaker at this forum. That's why I will have a very it's not have much good preparation, but I'm going to talk about new Southern policies of South Korea and Vietnam, South Korea economic cooperation, Vietnam, ASEAN, Korea economic cooperations. I don't know how to share. It could not be shared here. Yeah, okay. In my presentation, I focus on 3 points. First, I would like to have a short overview of Korea economic presence
Dr.
in
Huang,
Vietnam and ASEAN.
excuse me. Sorry to interrupt, but would you please share your screen? Share your presentation file, because
I have shared it.
Share, but we can't see your presentation files to the screen.
I don't know why I have shared it.
But would you please check one more time, because we can't see your presentation files through the screen?
Have you seen it? I shared it. Have you seen it?
Did you share?
Yeah, I have shared it. Also on the screen, it says that your screen are sharing now. But in the side, what happened? I don't know.
Okay, Dr. Huang, we can't see your presentation file, so we are going to upload your file on our side. So
okay, thank
you just see the presentation file, and when you just move to the next slide, please say next. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your cooperation.
We know that in 2017, in November 2017, Korea has announced the new Southern policies in order to deepen the country's relation with some of its partners in South Asia and South Asia. And also 3 pillars of the policy have been identified that concentrates, focus on peace, prosperity, and people. And one of the most important objectives in the policy is economics. And it's not only economics, but it goes beyond economic because of the main objective of the New South Wales policies is Korea try to deepen and strengthening the existing economic relation with Southeast Asia and ASEAN countries, not only economic relation, but also go beyond that. And look back to the economic relationship between South Korea and ASEAN and Vietnam. Is the first diagram I show that the trade relationship between Korea and Vietnam and ASEAN. So you look at the screens, you have seen that since 1989, before Vietnam and Korea established official diplomatic relationship, we saw that the economic relationship between trade relation between Vietnam and ASEAN with Korea is very low. But after that, since 2000, the amount of the relationship between the two sides have increased. And recently, after Korea announced new southern policies, you have seen since 2017 that trade relationship between ASEAN and Korea increased rapidly. And also from Vietnam side, only trade with Vietnam, it make up about 40 to 45% of trade between ASEAN with South Korea. It shows that the Vietnam very important economic partner of South Korea, and it's skewed toward Vietnam in trade relationship with Korea. That among 10 ASEAN countries, Vietnam is very important partners. It shows in trade relationship between Korea and Vietnam. And looking back at outward direct investment from South Korea to ASEAN and to Vietnam and to CLM countries, you can see that in the diagrams, it also since 2017 to present, except 2020 with the impact of COVID-19, and we have seen that the ODI outward direct investment from Korea to Vietnam is very high, make up very large parts compared to ODI from Korea to ASEAN countries, to ASEAN 5 countries, including Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. It shows that Vietnam important. Also, Korea saw that in its tightening economic relation, not only ASEAN but also Vietnam play important parts in Korea in its implementation of new southern policies. And look at to official development assistance to Asia in 2010 to 2018. We also saw that the ODA to Vietnam also is very high recently, especially in recent years. It also another evidence proves that Vietnam still have a very good position in South Korea's economic cooperation policies, not only with Asia but also with ASEAN countries. Also, among 10 ASEAN countries, we saw that ODA to 10 ASEAN countries that Vietnam make a large part in the zero section in the diagram. You can see only Vietnam also get the large part ODA from South Korea. It means in new southern policy by Korea, also Korea try to tighten the economic relation with ASEAN. But among ASEAN countries, Vietnam is very important partners. Vietnam play very important position in South policy and South Korea and South Peace. The evidence from above shows that the trade investment reflects the state of play before New South policy and after New Southern policy by the Koreans. And they also reflect the long-term trends in economic relation between South Korea and ASEAN and Vietnam. So from that evidence, there's some comments to to be made. First, ASEAN's important partner for Korea and Vietnam, also one of the very important partner for Korea, South Korea, but Korea is still relatively marginal partner for ASEAN, lagging far behind from its traditional Asian competitors like China and Japan. Due to its small size, Korea is not able to compete with China and Japan on this market, but must find a way to set its contribution part from its competitors. I think it's time for Korea to make its noise after COVID-19. I will discuss more about this in final parts of COVID-19 direction of cooperation between South Korea and ASEAN and Vietnam. And second, that heavy Korea economic engagement of Korea in ASEAN and in Vietnam to some extent, that we saw that Vietnam looms last. Vietnam still become important, while other countries remain relatively marginal targets from trade and FDI outward direct investment and ODAs. And Korea has managed to cultivate strong trade investment relations with Vietnam. It worked very successful for the case of relationship, economic relationship between Korea, South Korea with Vietnam, but it's less success in the case of other countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. And also, it saw that somehow that the data and evidence in 2017 to 2020, we still have we can have a conclude that somehow South Korea and SP somehow success not only with ASEAN country but with Vietnam. And second point of my presentation is I would like to discuss about NSP of Korea, that it look at economic cooperation dimension with ASEAN and Vietnam is important. I think that it's very important because one of the major objectives of the NSP is economic dimension is to seek to reduce Korea's excessive economic dependence on China, and also to compete with South Korea's neighboring competitors like Japan. It proves that recently South Korea has also paid a lot of attention with Mekong area, especially in CLMV countries, in the Mekong sub-regions. It shows a lot of engagement by Korea in this region that recently reducing the attention from Japan, because before South Korea and SP, that Japan play very important role in fostering cooperation and development in Mekong sub-region, in lower Mekong countries, like 5 countries of five inland ASEAN countries: Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. And other objectives of NSP is that to reinforcement of the rationale for seeking to diversify away from China, because before we know that South Korea is dependent on China much because the last trade relationship from South Korea is with China, and it shows that South Korea become more dependent on China. That now South Korea try to look the way to diversify its relationship, economic relationship with other countries in order to reduce that dependence with China. And NSP, I think that one of the most important instruments to have South Korea to go away from the to reduce that dependence on China on economic relations. And the third point to be made is that new southern policies aim at facilitating the further expansion of private sectors based economic integration between Korea and its southern partners through various means. Southern partners in NSP, but Korea is not only 10 ASEAN countries, but also some countries in South Asia. But the most important partners, I think that located in ASEAN countries, it means 10 ASEAN countries. Among them, Vietnam play very important positions. And thus, it's considered important to, in the context that Korea wishes to divert away from economic influence of China in the context of COVID-19 crisis. And it's very important for South Korea that to reinforce its position in ASEAN, in Vietnam, after COVID-19, in order to promote economic cooperation with ASEAN and Vietnam in the post-COVID-19 periods. And final points in my presentation that I would try to ask a question or to raise the issues of South Korea new southern policy and economic cooperation with ASEAN and Vietnam is a post-COVID-19 direction, which way should go. We know that NSP has more concrete strategy compared with initial versions, especially NSP+. I think that's very important to concretize strategy toward promoting economic cooperation with ASEAN and Vietnam in the post-COVID-19. And also the NSP and NSP+. It's very clear to provide a framework, objectives, and instruments to achieve that objective of the economic cooperation with ASEAN and Vietnam. Before the launch of new southern policies, it was up to, I think that in Korea, it was up to private sectors to deepen relationship between ASEAN and Korea and Vietnam and Korea. But after some time, Korea realized that the government, the government actors is very important, and it should play a lead and plays an important role to direct relationship between Korea and Vietnam and ASEAN, beside private sectors and other organizations, and also NSP may also have a chance to induce, because it does not develop a vacuum, but deepen and strengthen already existing economic cooperations. And there are real conversions of the goal between private sectors and the government. And institutional change may have its new policy toward ASEAN remain interest in future, regardless of new government of Korea in future. It means that it's a post-COVID-19, in my opinion, that new southern policies and new southern policy plus would be success. If the Korea look beyond that economic cooperation, not only economic cooperation, but other cooperation with ASEAN and Vietnam, with COVID-19 crisis, it also chance to enhance cooperation between Korea and ASEAN and Vietnam to consolidate and develop beyond existing economic cooperations. In my opinion, I suggest some recommendation for promoting relationship between Korea and Vietnam and Korea and ASEAN after COVID-19. First, I think that in the post-COVID-19, Korea should be an active and responsible players in Asia in general and in Southeast Asia in particular, especially in Mekong sub-regions. I mean that in CLMV countries, because CLMV countries stay in the north-south economic corridors to connect South Korea with Southeast Asia, inland South Asia, and insular South Asia countries. And second point is that COVID-19 pandemics would provide opportunity for South Korea to engage more in ASEAN and Vietnam to enhance new southern policies. That maybe is very good opportunities and chance for South Korea to have a possible competition with China and Japan improvise ODA in provides outward direct investment and in promote trade and investment not only in Vietnam but also in ASEAN countries, especially in CLMV countries, in Mekong sub-region countries. And third point I would like to recommend here is that the two sides, especially South Korea, should share experience in safe tourism recoveries because it's very important. The two sides have very good economic relationship, and we should share that experience in safe tourism recovery to promote tourism cooperation between Vietnam and Korea and between Vietnam and ASEAN countries. And the fourth point to be made is that the two sides, especially from South Korea side, should deepen economic relations in trade and investment in the post-COVID-19, especially investment in IT and high-tech industries. And to form, it's a very good opportunity for two sides to form supply and production chains after break up supply chain during COVID-19 and trade war between US and China. It's very good opportunity for South Korea to be a player in this aspect, to play more role in the regions. And the final point to be made here is that the two sides should promote cooperation in digital economies and in green economies in order to provide more eco-environment for digital industry and digital economy for development relationship between Vietnam and South Korea and ASEAN and South Korea. And also with that, with the cooperation in digital economy and green economies, it would promote relationship between the two countries in the safe economy recovery after COVID-19. I think that is that because ASEAN and Vietnam still play a very important role. And I think to promote Korea relationship with total ASEAN regions, Korea should reconsider economic relationship with, maybe I think that to make that balance relationship with not only Vietnam but other important Southeast ASEAN countries. Because in recent years that trade and investment and ODA relationship between trade and investment ODA from Korea to Southeast Asia, it seems to skew towards Vietnam more than other countries. I think more important is that it should balance and not only much consolidate to enhance cooperation with Vietnam, but also to enhance relationship with important ASEAN countries. It's very good for Vietnam to be very important partner of South Korea, to get much more ODI, OFI, ODI, ODR, ODI. But I think that for a sustainable relationship between Korea and ASEAN, it should be and to have Korea to be role players, to be very important partners in ASEAN, and to can compete with other countries. Korea should balance relationship, especially economic relation with major ASEAN countries. I think ASEAN 5 or ASEAN 6, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore. It's my presentation. Thank you very much for the attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Huang, for sharing your insights through your excellent presentation. 네, Dr. 후안 국장님.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Huang, He said that we can utilize this COVID-19 as an opportunity to facilitate trade and investment in ASEAN and Vietnam, especially for many companies in Korea. We really look forward to much cooperation between the two regions. So thank you very much.
So we have heard all three presentations. The KIEP, KIET, and the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies are pursuing various research at the national level. And in particular, since the 2019 ASEAN ROK Commemorative Summit, Korea and ASEAN at the national policy level have been discussing various cooperation measures. So we would like to pursue some more in-depth discussions during the panel session. And let me introduce the moderator and the panelist for session 1. We have the moderator, Executive Director Kim Ge-hwan of the Center of International Industry and Trade of KIET. And please welcome Mr. Kim with a big round of applause. And next we have the panelist, Professor Lee Yo-hwan of Busan University of Foreign Studies. Please come forward to the stage and please welcome our two gentlemen with a big hand. And also the three presenters. Mr. Min Hyuk-ki, Director of Trade Policy Division at KIET, will also be joining us offline for the panel session. And we have the two online presenters who will also join us for the panel session, Director Jano Hwang and Dr. La. And now I'd like to hand over the microphone to the moderator. You have until 12:20, Mr. Kim. And you have the floor. Good day. I am, as introduced, Kim Ge-hwan, Executive Director of the Center for International Industry and Trade at KIET. I'm very grateful to be here at this important event. So the topic is, of course, I'd like to highlight the word new ASEAN ROK cooperation plans after COVID-19. I think that we are at a historic juncture. And of course, in the advent of COVID-19, we stand at a very important crossroads. And as all three presenters have consistently highlighted, the digital transformation and the green transformation, which is a major technological paradigm shift, is happening right now. And the speaker from Vietnam has mentioned the U.S.-China trade conflict. And against this backdrop, the realignment of the industry of this region of the world, along with the reshuffling of the global trade, is at the focus. And here we have gathered to discuss the cooperation plans between ASEAN and ROK. And not only in ASEAN, but the global economic reform is taking place. And at this juncture, I think we are addressing a very timely and important topic. So the three presenters have, not only from Korea, but from the ASEAN region, has given us a presentation on the way forward for our cooperation measures. And many important points have been raised. We cannot discuss all the points, but I would like to just point on the key matters raised. So we have a designated panel discussion today, and we have the panelist, Professor Lee Yo-hwan of Busan University of Foreign Studies, will be giving us a designated panel discussion. For a long period of time regarding Southeast Asian economy, Professor Lee has studied and researched, and he has already read through the presentation materials and analyzed them. So I'm sure that the important discussion points will be raised by Professor Lee. We have limited time. I think that we are 7-8 minutes behind schedule. If it is allowed, I would like to give Professor Lee about 7 minutes to give us a panel discussion. And if we have time left, I would like to raise a couple of questions. And finally, I would like to hand over the microphone to the presenters to take the questions and answers and continue with the discussion. So first, Professor Lee from BUFS. Hello, I am Lee Yo-han. First of all, I would like to thank all three presenters for your presentations. In terms of ROK ASEAN and ROK Vietnam relations, I think you have given us a great summary. And as for those points, I don't really have any new issues to raise or any new views to share. But COVID-19 is becoming a very important buzzword nowadays, and in particular, taking an important place as a variable in the ASEAN-ROK relations. But rather than looking at COVID-19 as a crisis, I think we need to look at it as an opportunity. Because after COVID-19, if you look at what is happening, we are not in reverse. We are just going the way only at a faster pace. Non-face-to-face services, development of informatization were going to happen anyhow, but it's just that, as you all know, the pace has picked up. In ASEAN, how we look at ASEAN, the perspective, I think is still limited. Koreans tend to think of ASEAN as a less developed region than Korea. But if you look at actual data, when it comes to mobile banking, usage of mobile banking or internet shopping, online shopping, there are many ASEAN nations that stand out and are ahead of Korea. And as you know, including Indonesia, there are unicorn companies really growing quickly in ASEAN nations. 9 unicorn companies are there, and within 3 years, the number will double. And so, our perspective towards ASEAN so far was more of a production base, a trade partner for our trade surplus. But we need to undergo a paradigm shift in our perspective. We need to look at ASEAN as a consumer market. And in the age of informatization, ASEAN can present us with a large opportunity as a region. And this is how we need to look at ASEAN. And as for the New Southern Policy, which has already been addressed in depth, as a researcher of Southeast Asia, I believe that the NSP is quite timely and important. And we also have the New Southern Policy Plus to upgrade the NSP. But next year, we will be having a new administration coming into office. I think the key here is how consistently these policies will be pursued with the new government. And as our scholar from Vietnam has mentioned, many government policymakers or scholars are well aware of the new Southern policy, but the matter is how long it will persist with how much consistency. I think that is the key point. And secondly, specificity. New Southern Policy Plus was announced a year ago, and there are many different agendas included in the New Southern Policy Plus. After reading through all the details, I think most of them have not reached much result or achievement. No action has taken place for most of these initiatives or after the announcements. So specifying the policies will be important. And lastly, our linkage with ASEAN or connectivity with ASEAN is important. We always say, announce in a one-way manner, this is the new deal, this is the new Southern policy, and we will be doing this. It is rather a one-way communication from Korea to ASEAN, but will the ASEAN nations, what kind of views of ASEAN does ASEAN want us to reflect? What is the actual demand in ASEAN, or what is the ASEAN's expectations to Korea? What is the priority or competitive edge that we have? These are points that we require further research. Of course, we have done well so far, but going forward, for an even better ROK ASEAN relations, these are the points we need to think deeply about. That is all from me. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Lee. And although I am a moderator, if you can give me the role of a panelist as well, I would like to raise a couple of more points. We have questions posted by our anonymous participants. ASEAN ROK cooperation has focused heavily on manufacturing. But as Professor Lee has mentioned, the digital sector, services, or many other sectors need to be included through diversification of our cooperation. Dr. La has raised this during your presentation. If you look at the ROK ASEAN cooperation in the years 2000, for about 10 years, trade increased dramatically. But since 2010, the growth rate has rather remained stagnant. On the other hand, if you look at trade, ever since 2000 onwards, the trade has been steadily on the rise. So ROK ASEAN cooperation is shifting from trade-based cooperation to investment-based cooperation, I believe. And Mr. Hui Huang, Director General, in your presentation, you mentioned the FDI from Korea into Vietnam.
So in 2010, there has been a lot of growth in terms of the FDI to ASEAN region. And Dr. La and Dr. also Hui Huang, you've all pointed out the fact that from 2000 and 2010, Korea's cooperation for ASEAN has actually undergone some significant changes. Perhaps I could ask Dr. La for her comments on this. And Dr. Min?
You mentioned your area of research is digital-based trade. And in addition to Mr. Lee's point earlier, how can we specify digital cooperation between ROK and ASEAN?
And to Dr. Hui Huang, you talked about areas of cooperation between Korea and ASEAN and Korea and Vietnam. You talked about the restructuring of global value chains, especially considering the fact that there is a conflict between the U.S. and China, trade, as well as the dependence to be reduced from Korea on China. So from Vietnam's point of view, what are some of the areas in which Korea and Vietnam or Korea and ASEAN can actually cooperate in relations to the realignment or restructuring of the global value chains? And in what ways can we really cooperate on that? Because from Korea to Japan, Korea to China, and from West Asia to other regions, I think there's actually a frontier economy being developed in ASEAN. And in that process, there's that realignment underway for the global value chain. I think the cooperation between Korea and ASEAN is going to become very critical going forward. That is going to be a key agenda for cooperation. So I'd like to get your views on that, Dr. Huang.
Thank you. I think that in my presentation, I have mentioned about the objective of Korea's New Southern Policies and New Southern Policy Plus is to diversify economic relationship between with Korea, economic relationship with ASEAN and with Vietnam, in order to reduce its dependence on China. It's very important for South Korea to find a way how to be more dependent on economic perspective. To do so, I think that with the help of COVID-19 pandemic, as I have mentioned, that COVID-19 pandemic also play very very negative impact on economies of ASEAN and of South Korea and economic relationship between the two sides. But also it would create some opportunity for South Korea to realize that how to diversify economic relations with Vietnam and ASEAN countries. I think that it's very important area. See that because in 2017 that South Korea when Korea announced the launch of new southern policies, Korea has diversified its relationship with Vietnam and ASEAN by investing in high tech, in digital economies, and in high value added economy. It's a way to form supply chains and production chains in order to have the production manufacturing sectors in Korea not much heavily dependent on China. It means that the area for cooperation in the post COVID-19 pandemic I had mentioned already is that would be promoting relation in digital and high value added in manufacturing sectors. That I think that South Korea has a potential to support Vietnam and other ASEAN countries in these sectors in order to form a new supply chains between South Korea and ASEAN, between South Korea and Vietnam, and production chains, because we have north-south economic corridors connecting South Korea to inland South Asian countries, and also promoting South Korea cooperation with Mekong sub-region countries, I mean in Seoul, MV, and Thailand. They're very important, and other sectors. I think as a sector, I think very important actor in promoting relationship with between South Korea and Vietnam and ASEAN is to promote digital economy and green economies, and to have to form some startup eco environment in ASEAN countries and in Vietnam, in order to compensate for South Korea to when it's try to reduce dependence on China, because I think that the potential of Vietnam and ASEAN countries now is quite promising. It would somehow it compensates some loss from for Korea from trying to reduce dependence on China and to diversify economic cooperation with ASEAN and Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you. 예, 감사합니다. 두 번째
Yes. Next, Dr. La, would you like to take the question and points raised by Professor Lee and my question also?
Could you give us your opinions or views? Before the question, so what exactly do you want me to speak about? Because I wasn't able to catch everything you said. To Dr. La, my question was back in 2010. No, not exactly about that question. You wanted me to give you a response to the question, and you also wanted me to talk about something else. Is that right? Is there a comment to be made? Right. Professor Lee made a comment regarding your presentation, so you can respond to that as well and also answer my question. So thank you. So I will give my response in the order of the questions posed to me. Dr. Lee posed a very important question. New Southern policy, as a matter of fact, Of course, I think it would be very crucial in terms of maintaining its consistency, because one of the concerns of ASEAN is that NSP may be just one-off policy. It may not be valid or sustainable if there's a change in the hands of the government. So, ensuring consistency of the policy was a goal of the current government. Hence, the upgrade version of NSP, the NSP Plus, was unveiled by the government. So, of course, going forward, we would have to work to ensure the consistency in policies. And the policies will have to be made more concrete and substantive. There are a range of concrete projects and programs under NSP. And I understand that the government has not been actually making announcements or presentations on the outcomes or deliverables from the NSP-related initiatives and programs. So I think they really have to communicate and promote the deliverables from the programs and the projects, which have been quite lacking up until this point. And I think that is something that will be worked on by the government. I understand that there is a plan to that effect. And as long as this problem is addressed going forward, NSP will be able to fully unlock its potential. Perhaps the issues or the problems or the concerns that people were raising to that effect will be alleviated. And also, Dr. Kim posed some very interesting questions regarding trade. If you look at the trade between Korea and ASEAN, right after the FTA in 2007, we saw significant growth in terms of the bilateral trade volume. I know I didn't really spend a lot of time on that, but the growth rate began to level off. Didn't spike afterwards. Yet the investment between the two regions began to go up dramatically. As for the investment figures, I know I am unable to share the slide, but in 2019 and 2020, there was a significant investment made by Korea into ASEAN, and the growth rate continued. And as was mentioned by Mr. Kim, due to various factors, we saw such growth in terms of trade and investment. But going deeper into the trade, we saw rapid growth in the export, but the import from ASEAN into Korea became quite modest. So it would be surplus for Korea, which went up dramatically, and this problem has not been addressed because there are a lot of export of intermediate goods from Korea to ASEAN region, which is surplus for Korea and deficit for ASEAN region, which leads to imbalances in trade between Korea and ASEAN. But all in all, what's really important is that we really don't see a likewise level of import from ASEAN to Korea. So we need to actually push forward increasing the import volume from ASEAN to Korea. But we cannot really do that as part of an artificial measure. It has to be natural and has to be win-win proposition. One way would be to advance the level of GVC, and once we have more production between our two regions, then there would be naturally a bigger volume of import from ASEAN to Korea. That's probably the right approach for Korea in terms of addressing these trade imbalances with the ASEAN region. I'm not sure whether I've addressed your concerns. So if you have any further questions, then I will try to answer them. I'm sorry, I'm unable to give you more time to that.
We are quite behind schedule, but to Dr. Min again, if you would like to address the comment from Professor Lee and my questions, please. Yes. First, about the comment by Professor Lee, I couldn't agree more. We do need consistent projects that should also be concrete, and I agree. We need to ensure consistency. But what is fortunate is that in the past there have been fluctuations, but regarding policy tools, ASEAN, in the past, when there was a shift of government, for example, from President Roh to President Lee, in many cases, the policy remained in place with consistency, and I hope that continues on into the future for our new Southern policy. And as for the question on the cooperation in the digital sector, likewise in eco-friendly sectors, I think that going forward, digital sector will be an important focal point for our future cooperation. I think we can take two approaches. One, how to build capacity, and two, how to address the conventional side. So in terms of building capacity, as Professor Lee has mentioned earlier, in many parts of this, many ASEAN nations already have strong capacity in the digital sector. So during the industrialization, Korea did provide assistance, for example, education and training for ASEAN, but that shouldn't be where our cooperation needs to be limited. We can conduct joint research, we can pursue joint projects or businesses, and build capacity along the way. And as for trade, this is a very important area of cooperation. Digital and eco-friendly sectors are the rising stars, but the manufacturing sector should not be disregarded either. In terms of trade, regarding digital trade, global uniform standards have yet to be developed. So in these areas, I think that we can be more proactive and preemptive in taking our approach. And in this sense, ASEAN has many potential areas that can pursue cooperation with Korea. So there are various trade issues. What's more important could be related to data or data transfer between nations. In these important areas, we need to look at how to set up norms or standards among Korea and ASEAN, so that when we take the discussion to the global stage, we can maybe not take initiative, but at least make a voice onto the global stage. And lastly, regarding GVC, the manufacturing global value chain is still important and will remain important, but in terms of digital sector, we do need to consider the global value chain as well. In relation to data, for example, how data is produced and how data is utilized are some of the areas where we can look at possible cooperation in different nations. And just one more thing regarding the value or supply chain. We heard from the presenter from Vietnam, and I couldn't agree more with your point. Yes, although it was not a strategic item, urea water shortage was a major issue in Korea. And anyhow, reliance on a single source should be moved away from, and in that sense, for Korea to diversify sources, ASEAN region has a big role to play. Yes, we would like to go another round of discussions, but in the interest of time, I must conclude this session. First of all, I would like to thank our speaker from Vietnam, Director General Nguyen Huy Hong, for joining us all the way from Vietnam, and also to Dr. La and Dr. Min for your presentations, and also Professor Lee from joining us from Busan. Thank you very much, and I hope, as I said earlier, I hope ROK ASEAN cooperation leads for our regions to lead at the frontier of the realignment of the world, and how to cooperate in our path. I hope that Korea and ASEAN learned more important points, and that is the end of all the panel discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the moderator and the panelists for joining us. And as with all panel sessions, sharing insights and information is always healthy, and we never have enough time. But despite the short time, thank you for sharing such an important insight, and I'd like to thank all participants for joining us. This is the end of the morning session, and we will see you this afternoon at 2 p.m. Korea time for an even more enriched discussion. Thank you.